1 Kings chapter 4. Now, I am going to overview the first 19 verses, and I'll just explain why. A lot of names in here in which I could read and do a decent job of acting like I'm sure of them, but I'm not really. But I'll just spare you all of that and give you a bit of a summary. And again, if you wanted to read them on your own, I would encourage it if you wanted to. But it just starts by saying in chapter 4, verse 1, "So King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his officials." And it just lays out who his officials were. And I'll just give you another summary here in verse 4. It says, this particular man, Benaiah, was over the army. And then in verse 6, Adoniram was over the labor force. So it just kind of breaks down different guys in their roles. So we're going to talk about leadership in a moment. But also in verse 7, it says that he made 12 governors over all Israel. So what Solomon does, is something new with the leadership structure in Israel, which is interesting. He's not so bound to the past, but he's faithful to it, as we'll see before we close out tonight. But he sees an opportunity to do things different with the government structure in Israel. What he does is he divides Israel up into 12 districts. And in those 12 districts, they all have to pay taxes 1 month out of the year. But that 1 month covers all of the grocery bill for King Solomon. So in the grand scheme of things, and we read it's a lot of groceries, it's a lot of food, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a very moderate way for the nation of Israel to support its government. So it's not like they're overtaxed. It's that 1 month out of the year they're responsible for that, and the rest of the year it's all them. Which, could you imagine that? How cool would that be? But just saying, and that's all I can say, really. Actually, I don't have more for you on that. But it does bring up something interesting, and especially in the world that we live in today. Do you know one of the most popular selling category of books out there are leadership books? It's huge. People want and desperately need leadership, and they strive for it, they yearn for it, they want to just identify it, what is good leadership. And so I want to take the opportunity tonight, given the transition from David to Solomon, and Solomon's great wisdom, to point something out. Now, this is not an exhaustive touch on leadership, but just a statement or two here, okay? Solomon, it says, is king over all of Israel. So he's in charge. There's no doubt about it. Now, I want to point this out to you, that God's structure throughout the Bible is that headship, leadership, that it's a hierarchy, okay? That at the end of the day, it all boils down to one person. And whether it's a marriage, right? In a marriage, that role is for no one really knows, right? No, I'm just kidding. It's for the husband, right? At the end of the day, God has made it that the headship in a marriage is a husband, right? I know the world rails against that. I don't care. God has designed it, and that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, right? That headship is in the home. Headship is in the family. Headship is in the church. It's in government structure. God has all of that laid out. And throughout the whole Bible, it never changes. God's structure is always this way. So just pay attention to that. King Solomon was over all of Israel. Now, we all understand and know there's no way that Solomon could oversee all of Israel, especially when we understand the magnitude of it. So what he does is put people underneath his authority, overseeing districts and areas and people and groups and military, all labor force, all of it. But again, because the world is yearning for leadership, let me just say a couple things on it. There are, and this is just my list, it's not, again, exhaustive. There are 3 basic forms of leadership that we are constantly faced with. Again, you can do a deeper dive, you can find 6, 9, 12 structures of leadership, but the ones that, in my estimation, for what it's worth, you boil them down, there are 3 main forms of leadership, okay? 1 is anarchy, 2 is plurality, and 3 is hierarchy. Again, boiled down, simply put, that's the 3 main kind of leadership structures that you're going to find. Now, anarchy is just the idea that there is no leader, that we all just kind of like feel our way through and no one's in charge. That's anarchy. And again, not the greatest definition, but here's the thing that I have seen, even with my personal experience with anarchy and trying to live that lifestyle of no government, no authority, no control, we're all in this together. I have learned from personal experience that in anarchy, there's always a hierarchy, right? It's inescapable, friends. There are just natural-born leaders, even in anarchy, and then in anarchy, there's some leadership structure, right? There's always someone at the top. So the very organization that rails against leadership finds itself with a leadership structure under the guise of, we don't have any leadership, okay? So anarchy is that, okay? So I would say the anarchy is a disaster, okay? The second kind of leadership is plurality. Now, plurality is a little bit cleaner, but I would say it's messy, right? And we have probably all seen, in one form or the other, a bunch of people getting together and sharing their opinions.
A committee.
Ah, there you go, a committee. But can we all attest to the fact that that's kind of a disaster itself, right? Because you put 5, 6 people together and not all of them agree, and then they argue, and then they're not sure, and then no one's settled, and then 3 people are upset and 2 people are happy. Plurality is not something you see. What we see consistently through the Bible that's always effective and very clean, it's not perfect, it's not without flaw, but it is the most clean and it's the most effective. It's hierarchy. That is why the world runs on hierarchy. Look at any system, any structure. It doesn't matter what it is. A business. That's why you have a CEO. You always have some form of a head, a role. At the end of the day, this person calls the shots. And that was Solomon. No one was confused who was overseeing Israel. Solomon was that guy. Having said all that, he had all of his different administrators underneath him. So again, for what it's worth, biblical model throughout the whole Bible, hierarchy is certainly the path that is shown to us. I thought that was a convenient way to chew through 19 verses there. So, picking up in verse 20 here, Judah, it says, and all Israel were numerous as the sand by the sea in its multitude. Eating and drinking and rejoicing. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Now in verse 22, Solomon, his provisions for one day were 30 cores of fine flour. Now a core is like a 55-gallon drum, if you can visualize that. So 30 55-gallon drums of fine flour, 60 core of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep beside deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tispa even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on every side all around him. And in verse 25, Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Now Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. And these governors, each man in his month, provided food for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table. There was no lack in their supply. They also brought barley and straw to the proper place for the horses and steeds, each man according to his charge. Now there's lots that we will consider here. Now, starting with this, they were eating and drinking is a euphemism for saying it was good times. It was just good times had by all in Israel. They were enjoying peace and serenity and light taxes and an enjoyable government. They just enjoyed it immensely is the idea. Everyone was eating and drinking and rejoicing. I mean, not where we're at in America today, right? Everyone's complaining, everyone's upset. Like, it's not that way. It was like the opposite. It's like everyone's like, this is awesome. Yup, pretty sweet, dude. Just rejoicing, just thrilled. And anytime the kingdom came up, people were like, peh, I can't stand it, like we do in America. They were like, this is awesome. Get me another lemonade with that little umbrella in it. This is so cool, man. That's how they lived. It was awesome. Could you imagine? And so much so that the golden age of Israel of all time will be in Solomon's reign. When it says the river, you can look it up if you have a reference Bible, it's the river Euphrates in Iraq. So all the way from Iraq to Egypt, essentially, it is all of what we call the Middle East today. All of it. Isn't that amazing? All of it. That ends up being 300,000 square miles for Solomon. Now again, they're mostly concentrated in the area that we would know today as Israel, Jerusalem, that whole area of Israel today. But again, their borders and what they had oversight of was that grand and huge. Much more like what God had designed for them going into the promised land. So that being said, by the way, the amount of food that we're talking about here, scholars estimate on the conservative side that this amount of food would feed at least 15,000, some say upwards of 30,000 people every day. Now, we know that that's not just Solomon's immediate family. Those are his servants. Those are people that work for the government. I mean, he just fed a lot of people every single day. So again, the golden age in Israel's history. Can you just imagine that all your food was taken care of? And it wasn't the kind of government assistance where it was like lousy. It was like awesome. You woke up and you had the finest food every day, all day, taken care of, not on your dime at all. Not a problem. So, there's that. Now in verse 26 it said that Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses. Now, unfortunately, 2 Chronicles 9 tells us that it was 4,000 horses. And I bring that up to be honest and transparent with you. I've always said if there was something bad or wrong in the Bible, I would want to tell you, and I really don't want to play games. I'd be out of here. I'd be the first one out the door kind of thing. But what's interesting is it is a scribal error, okay? I'll just be honest with that. The best we can tell, it's a scribal error. Now, what's interesting is that people assume that the 40,000 number is the error, not the 4,000. I'm just here to say we don't know which one it is. I'm being completely honest with you. We don't know if the scribe messed up adding a zero or not putting in a zero, right? But the point is, between those two accounts, there is a discrepancy there. And that could be as simple as a scribe writing it out and putting the wrong number down, for example. Now, I say that because when you talk to a skeptic, they'll say, there's so many errors in the Bible. There's so many scribal errors in the Bible. And just ask them this question, like what? And here's what you'll find, more often than not, they will have not one reference for you. They won't even have one written down in a note somewhere. They don't know. They've heard it and they propagate that idea. I'm here to say that it is true. There are some scribal errors. But it's not the kind of errors that make a difference. It's the smallest kind of error. Like, again, I understand that thousands of horses are an issue as far as exactness, but it doesn't change the truth of the story at all. And that is the case with any scribal discrepancy that we would ever talk about in the Bible. It's so minuscule that it never affects the story. It never changes the outcome. It never changes the reliability of it. It's just a matter of whatever, a few thousand, 10,000, whatever the thing is. A lot of horses, right? Now, that being said, and the reason we don't know if it's 4,000 or 40,000 is one of the places that we go in Israel is Tel Megiddo. Now, Tel is a man-made hill. Israel is famous for this because it's ancient. Again, remember this. We're here on the East Coast. We know houses that are hundreds of years old, okay, all the time. We know people that live in houses that are hundreds of years old. We know people that live in historical houses that are hundreds of years old. I had the privilege, but I had the opportunity, I guess, to go to California once upon a time. And I remember our sort of tour guide was like, there is a really old house here. It's so amazing that it's still standing and it's here as a monument. And we're like, how old is it? They're like, 100 years old. I was like, are you kidding? I know so many people that live in a 100-year-old house. It's not a big deal, right? But that's because we live on the East Coast. Settlers settled here first and made their way to the East Coast, right? And just all of that testifies of the time that we've lived here as Americans on the East Coast. So again, 100-year-old house is crazy in California. Over here, a couple 300-year-old, wow, incredible. Go to Israel, 3,000, 5,000-year-old places, right? It's vastly different. And I say that because in those thousands of years of civilization, there are man-made hills. And all it is the civilization that was once there collapsed or was destroyed and made as a flat plateau and then built upon that over and over again. So many times whenever there's a man-made hill, they just dig into it and they find history. It's amazing in Israel. One of those is Tel Megiddo, overlooking the valley of Megiddo, or I would know it as Armageddon. And Tel Megiddo was a place where Solomon had some of his horse stalls. It's one of those phenomena that you go to and you can see all the places where he kept his horses, many, many horses. So again, was it 4,000 or 40,000? Just seeing Tel Megiddo with my own eyes, I could believe that it would be 40,000, no problem with the kind of jurisdiction that we're talking about. But that's what it is. But that being said, a much more practical application for us than that I'm going to turn there. You can if you want to Deuteronomy 17 for just a moment. And I'm going to read something so important that should have been so much more a part of Israel's history, but it just wasn't, okay? Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. It's in my Bible titled Principle Governing Kings. Okay, so this is amazing that God writes this in Deuteronomy by Moses before they ever had a king. And God says in verse 14 of Deuteronomy 17, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You will surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren, and you shall set a king over you, and you may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Now, quick pause there. Number one, God prophesied that when they go in the land, they would desire a king and they would have a king, even though he said he did not want them to have it. The way it was set up was that God would be the leader of Israel, but they wanted a king like all the other nations. And so God says, there's going to come a day where you're going to ask for it, and I'll give it to you in the promised land. Now, interestingly here, I just wanted to pause here because God says to Israel, you are not to have a foreigner over you. Now, this is where our founding fathers in America came up with the idea of a natural-born citizen as the President of the United States of America. For what that's worth to you. As they were reading requirements for a king, they said an important detail would be that a president of the United States, a quote-unquote king, but a president, would be a natural-born citizen of this nation. For what that's worth to you. Now, verse 16 says, but he shall not multiply horses for himself. He shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither, in verse 17, shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, and nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. All of these things that Solomon couldn't help himself, just racked them up. Horses, gold, and women. And in verse 18, most important part to me, also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of the law in a book, from the one before the priests and the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandments to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, and that he and his children in the midst of Israel. That is profound to me. One thing that I think is amazing, what an awesome practice for a king of Israel. As he came into Israel, the first thing he would have to do is write down a copy of the law. So it's not like, all right, day one, the president signing executive orders. Can you imagine? Where's the president? Where's the president? Where's the president? Hey, man, don't you know he was just put in office? Of course you know what he's doing. He's copying the law. He's copying God's word down. You imagine how long that would take him? We talk about the first 100 days of the president. The first 100 days is just copying the law, copying the law, copying the law. But wouldn't he be something awesome when he came out on the other side? A lot different man, wouldn't you expect? And that's why there's no hope in any earthly politician, especially when there's no commitment to God's word like that. And even Solomon and David, these men didn't do that. They did not heed that wisdom. We have no record of that at all. They just kind of did their thing. They were going at it full force. So I say that because it says, do not multiply horses. And whether it's 4,000 or 40,000, that's a multiplication of horses. Now, the reason for that is because, the psalm escaped me, but the psalm that David wrote says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will trust in the name of the Lord our God. David understood that. David's like, I'm not going to trust in our ability and our strength. We're going to trust in God. Because aren't those the coolest stories in the Bible? When God shows up and does what only he can do? And that's way easier for people in the Bible than for us, isn't it? But when we're in a position where only God can do it, not us, when we're in control, it's comfortable, right? But when only God can do it, that's amazing. Those are the stories that we read about. The impossible circumstances. Like God telling Gideon, you have too many soldiers, at the point where they don't have enough soldiers. You have 30,000 soldiers, too many, get rid of them. Whittles them down, gets 3,000 soldiers, and they're like, "Ooh, we can't lose any more." And God's like, too many. Cut them at 300. Now what are we going to do? God's like, perfect, now I can do it. Because if I had all these other people, you'd take the credit. So if I do it with 300 of you, there's clearly it's only me. And do you remember how that story goes, by the way? They encamp around the mountains, and the Lord tells them to take clay pots with fire in them and break them and start yelling. So the only reason God needed 300 guys was for this plan. So that surrounding the enemy, they just break the pots and go, "Ah!" That's it. Like, that's the battle plan? That's the battle plan. And what it does to the enemies is they freak out and they start killing each other. They think we're surrounded by enemies, oh my word. And they just start killing each other. They're all dead. And they show up and they take the victory. Only God, right? It wasn't those guys. It wasn't their genius. It was only God. God always likes to do that. Takes all the responsibility for us. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will trust in the name of the Lord our God. Now here's this too. In verse 28, Charles Spurgeon does a whole sermon on this. It's in the last verse where I'm talking about, verse 28. Each man according to his charge. Each man according to his charge. Now again, Charles Spurgeon does a thing. I'm going to read to you part of it in a second. But each man has his charge. And that is so true for every one of us. Each one of us has our responsibility, right? We don't got to do other people's responsibility. We got to do our responsibility. What is up to us to do? What has God given you and I to do? Galatians 6, verses 2 and verses 5 are very interesting in this context. Because in Galatians 6, verse 2, it tells us to bear one another's burdens, right? We're to be there for one another. But then he goes on to say in verse 5 that each one of us has our own burden to bear. That means we have the responsibility ourselves for what we're called to do, but there are times we're going to have to come and lift someone up or help somebody else out in their trial, in their tragedy. But primarily, remember, you and I have a responsibility. You and I have a responsibility. Now, let me read you what Spurgeon said here. He said, in Solomon's court, all his officers had a service to carry out, every man according to his charge, as it says. It is exactly so in the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. If we are truly his, he has called us to some work and office, and he wills us to discharge that office diligently. And this is my favorite part. We are not to be gentlemen at ease, but men at arms. Not loiterers, but laborers. Not glittering spangles, but burning and shining lights. Right? We got a job to do is the idea. We're not gentlemen at leisure. We're men and women at arms, right? We're at battle. That's what we're doing. It's a great reminder. Each one according to his charge. And I say this because I say it all the time. I think about some of the amazing work of God that I've been a part of, just in Machias, Maine alone, okay? And I have had the question posed to me from different people for different reasons. Like, how has that happened in Machias of all places? It's just a little podunk town of nowhere. And how is that happening? All that God's doing up there. And my answer has become something like this. It's a lot of people doing their job. That's all it is. It's never a mystery. It's always a lot of people doing their part. Not fighting with each other about the other person's part, doing their part. And that's what it is. When you see hundreds of people and addicts being set free and all this amazing stuff, it's individual people doing their part. What doesn't happen at church is everyone says, nah, I don't really want to do anything. I'm just going to kick back. Nothing great happens in those churches. Do we know that, right? Like, that's not how it happens. It's people saying, all right, I don't have a lot to give, but here's what I'm going to do. Here's my part to play in the whole thing. And that's when amazing things happen. So, every man according to his charge. So we read on, verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceeding great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand of the seashore. And thus in verse 30, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men. It's been said that all men are equally created, but not all men are equally gifted. And that's so true. Solomon was gifted with wisdom beyond. So in verse 31, he was wiser than all men, wiser than Ethan, the Ezrahite, and He-Man. He was a huge buff dude, by the way. I just couldn't help myself. Chalcol and Darda, the son of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. And in verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And so in verse 33, he spoke of trees from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish, and men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Now, just amazing. Keep in mind this too, by the way. Keep this in your mind. Do I have your attention? Here it is. Solomon is like 20 years old. What do we often say about a 20-year-old kid when we get a little older in life? They're just a kid. They're a puppy. They're a baby. Wah, right? Yeah, what are you talking about? You don't know anything. You're 20 years old. You know what I like to say? Charlie Kirk was 31 years old. And he changed the world at 31 years old. Is he just a kid? Is he just a small, doesn't know what he's doing? It's just something about Solomon, 20 years old. God has done such a work in his life that men traveled the world to talk to him, just to hear him speak. And he would talk about, it doesn't even matter. He was one of those brilliant guys. It didn't matter what he talked about. He could read a cereal box and you'd be entertained, right? He'd be like, oh, you see this tree right here? And he would give you the whole that's what they're saying. It didn't matter what he talked about. He knew everything. It's like the origin, the background, where it came from. Oh, and even that little weird plant that grows out of the wall. He'd be like, let me tell you about that. Just a really wise guy. Super sharp. Now, just to circle back on two of these guys here, Ethan and He-Man. Ethan wrote Psalm 89, by the way, if you're interested. And He-Man wrote Psalm 88. So each of them, in their own wisdom and in their own right, wrote a psalm, which is interesting. But again, Solomon's wisdom was just like in the stratosphere, beyond everyone else's, these guys that are being referred to. And again, these would be guys that people could like relate to, like, oh man, he was really smart. He was really smart. But like, not like Solomon. Solomon was like way out there. Now, in verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs. Just if you're wondering, like, well, how many proverbs do we have collected in the Bible? About 600. So we have lost at least 2/3 of his proverbs. Can you imagine? We have 1/3 of his proverbs and our minds are blown forever. Solomon was just a wizard like that. Now, obviously he gets this ability from his father, even the poetic nature of it. Notice it says he wrote songs. His father was a singer and a writer. Obviously he wrote most of the book of Psalms. David did. But for what it's worth to us, he wrote tons of songs, as it says here, 1,005. But in the Bible, again, outside of this one song, we've lost all of them. We only have one song, and it's the Song of Solomon, right? And that song is like his hit song, his number one, and one that would never be forgotten. Hence, we have it in the Bible. But the one song of the 1,000 songs that we have is the Song of Solomon. So just an interesting thing there. Now, chapter 5, This is amazing stuff. King Hiram of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon because he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always loved David. And Solomon sent Hiram and said, in verse 3, you know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God, because of the wars which were fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And just quick note here in verse 4, the word adversary, Hebrew, is literally Satan. We literally get our word Satan from it. And just a good reminder tonight, you and I, Satan is our true adversary. Remember that. Not someone in your family, not someone at church. Your true adversary is Satan. Wants to take you out, make you bitter, and ruin your life. Our adversary, Satan. But in verse 5, he said, "And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to my father David, saying, Your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, he shall build the house for my name. Now therefore command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servant will be with your servant, and I will pay your wages for your servant according to whatever you say. For you know there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians." And so it was, when Hiram heard these words of Solomon, that he rejoiced greatly, and he said, "Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people." Now, we're going to talk about why he has that response, but a couple interesting things for us tonight, okay? Number one, Hiram, according to Josephus, the first century historian, he said that Hiram was 19 years old when he became king in Tyre. He would reign for like 34 years. So the point is, and I believe he dies in his early 50s. Is that right? Sound about right? 53 or something like that. Hiram was 19 years old when he became king in Tyre. So sort of a neighboring area up there in Lebanon to Israel. And Solomon takes over when he's like 17 years old. He's 20 years old at this point. So we don't know exactly when they overlap time-wise, but the idea is this, that he could at least relate to him in the fact that he was a ruler over a great area like Tyre at a very young age. So you have a young king reaching out to another young king, and they just have that mutual respect, and like only they can appreciate what they've had to have as responsibility, if you will. And so there's that connection underlying. I just want to share that with you if you didn't know that. But Hiram loved David. Hiram did in fact love David. And David said, in planning for the temple to be built, someday when we build this thing, because God told him, you're a man of war, you got blood on your hands and you're too busy, you can't build my temple. Your son will do it. And so David from that day forward started saving resources and pulling blueprints together and working on things, because it drove David crazy that he, as the king of Israel, lived in this beautiful palace, and that he looked out and saw God living in a tent, so to speak. And it drove him crazy. And he even said, why would I live in a palace and my God would live in a tent? And that's when God said to David, I appreciate your heart. And even Nathan, if you remember Nathan the prophet, was so excited when David told him that he was going to do it. He's like, go for it, David. Do what's in your heart. The prophet, imagine the prophet of God's like, do it, man. And then God convicts the prophet when he goes home and he's like, nah, man, I do not want David to build my house. So Nathan has to go back and be like, sorry, you can't do it. But David's passion was for that. So much so, here's two Psalms that David wrote. Psalm 132 and Psalm 27. Beautiful poetic verses about the house of God. In Psalm 132, it's a verse that when we were building in Searsmont, the group of guys that were working 12, 14, 16, 18-hour days just to get that thing done in a short period of time during the COVID days, we had only a few months to get in there. We were up long nights, and we put up a plaque, Psalm 132, and it said, I will not give sleep to my eyes, nor slumber to my eyelids until I have found a place for the Lord. Okay? And so that was David's heart. Like, I can't even sleep in my own bed until we get something like this done for him. Psalm 27, this one thing I have desired of the Lord, and that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the courts of the Lord all the days of my life. Right? That's what was his desire, was that God would have this beautiful place that people could go and worship. And it could be respectable among the nations. And amazingly, God wasn't in a rush to do that. Isn't that a phenomenal thing? Like, think about all the other gods, all the other pagan gods that these amazing buildings were built for. And God wasn't like feeling left out. Like, oh, I need a big building. He's like, no, David, I want Solomon to do it, and it'll be right when he does it. And what's cool is Solomon honors his father, which so many lessons here. I don't want to get lost in any one of them, but this is one of the great reasons that Solomon will continue to just advance and be so incredible. As you think about Solomon, his father left him this order that he could have easily either A, blown off completely, or B, he could have undermined it and be like, all right, and took his dad's resources and built kind of a shabby thing or a decent thing, but nothing major. Solomon took that as serious as his father wanted him to. And my point is, his father is dead and gone. But what Solomon displays to all of us, all of humanity from that point on, is that he is a man under authority. That his father said this is an important detail to him that he would mete out. And Solomon said, absolutely, sir, I will get it done. And so first order of business for Solomon is to go back and find this guy and say, we need some lumber from you guys. Now just understand here the deal is. In Israel, even to this day, throughout all of history, it's been a place of stone. That's why everything was built out of stone. Very rarely would you find pieces of lumber to build most of their stuff. And so Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon were like California redwoods, just magnificent and huge and awesome. And so these cedars, you bring them down. Hiram, bring them down. But just a quick note, I know we were just talking about leadership earlier, but remember this, every one of us, from up here all the way to the back, we can never have spiritual authority unless we're under spiritual authority, right? And that is Solomon to a T. He has all of this powerful, awesome authority, but he is a man that is truly submitted to authority himself. It's a beautiful picture here. Now, he reaches out to Hiram, and he basically says, hey, my dad wanted this built. God didn't let him do it. He was too busy, whatnot. He said, but now it's different. Israel's at peace, and I want to do this. I want to honor what my father said and what God spoke to my father. And Hiram was so blessed. That's why his response is, blessed be the Lord God this day, for he has given David a wise son over all this great people. Now, let's read the end and just make a last few notes here. So Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the message which you sent me, and I will do all your desire concerning the cedars and cypress logs. My servant shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will float them in rafts by the sea to the place that you indicate. And then I will have them broken apart there, and then you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household. Now, quick note. Ends up bringing them to Joppa, a major seaport in those days. We go to Joppa when we go to Israel. It's also so many historical places. Joppa is also the place where Peter has that vision on the sheet in Joppa. He was there at lunchtime. That all happened there. But another amazing point is that's the very seaport that Jonah the prophet went to in rebellion. When God said, I want you to go to the Assyrians, he said, nope, and he went to the seaport, and he took a ship out of there. So he rolled out. So, interesting. But that's where they bring the logs down from Lebanon. They float them down. These are seafaring people, by the way. So they float these logs down, and they bring them into Joppa. And so he says, I'll do this. But here's what he says in verse 9 again. The only thing I want, the way he says it, you'll fulfill my desire by giving food for my household. So this isn't a free ticket, This isn't like I'm going to do it for free because we're bros, He says, all I ask is that you feed the guys, right? Feed the guys, feed us for working for you, and we'll get everything you want. It's an awesome deal. And yet, you know what Hiram doesn't do? He's not like, hey man, you're rich. I'm gonna charge you a ton of money, right? Solomon just told him, the richest man who lives on the earth, I will pay you whatever you want. That's a blank check, isn't it, folks? Well, I'm thinking that's about $55 million per log. Inflation. He says, okay, here's the deal. To the richest man out there, he's like, you just give us food. We'll do the job for you. It's an amazing gesture and deal, no doubt. Now, verse 10. Hiram gave Solomon cedar and cypress logs according to all his desire. And Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20 cores of pressed oil. And thus Solomon gave to Hiram year by year. So annually he'd give him a massive load of food and oil. And so in verse 12, the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty together. And isn't that beautiful in verse 12? I had it written down somewhere earlier. Yeah, right there. This is just a good deal. These are good deals where everybody wins. You know what I mean? We both win. And this is a deal where you're going to get all the logs you want at a really good price, and you're going to feed my guys, and it's going to be awesome. And they both mutually go above and beyond and give each other more than what is asked of them. So it's a really good deal. And therefore, looking at verse 12, there was peace between them, of course. It's hard to be mad at that kind of person, isn't it? We worked out a deal together. We've been honoring it, and so it is. That just popped in my head. I was just with a friend the other day. He made a deal over something. I won't even bring up what it is so I don't give him away. But he made a deal over something. And it was based on, I can't even say that. It was based on something. How's that? And it was something that could multiply. So the idea was, you're going to give me this, and if it multiplies, I'm going to give you that. With the intention that it's probably going to meet somewhere in the middle. Well, guess what? It multiplied completely against his favor. Completely. Like, every time it multiplied, he's like, are you kidding me? This guy is going to be as rich gets. He was just so bummed by the whole deal. And it was a handshake. It wasn't even a contract. And I just remember him trucking this thing, doing this thing, and he was explaining it to me, and he said, it was a deal. We made a deal. And I'm going to bring every one of them to him, even though it drives me crazy, right? Because we made a deal. And it's hard to be mad at a guy like that, isn't it? When he honors his arrangement and his deal is over a handshake, you could say, oh, we didn't sign anything, It's amazing. Well, in verse 13, King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. There were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. And Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens, 80,000 who quarried stones in the mountains, and beside 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies who supervised the people who labored in the work. And the king commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple. So Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gibeonites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stone to build the temple. So this is the thing that we're shifting into coming up, is the building of the temple. We're not even going to entertain looking into that at all tonight, other than how important this is, that Solomon, when it says that he was granted wisdom, that he did things in such a way that made sense across the board for everybody. Right down to the workers. He doesn't overexert the workers. He gives them a job and he puts them to work, but he treats them really well. Here's the arrangement. I don't know if you caught it when we were reading it. He has 30,000 guys, but he puts them in units of 10,000. And so for a month, you would go with 10,000 of your brothers and you'd go work for a month in this beautiful place, helping Hiram. But then you'd come home for 2 months. So you'd work for a month and come home and rest for 2 months. Everything Solomon did was thoughtful and methodic and planned and considerate of everybody at play. He wasn't just burning everyone and burning out the wheels. He just carefully administered everything across the board. And it just brings up a last point, that this connection that he has with Hiram. I mean, this is just good for neighboring kingdoms that could be at war with each other. Instead of being at war, what an awesome thing. Let's be at peace, they would say. And this brings up an interesting topic as we end here. Something that was famous a few decades ago called friendship evangelism. And it's a beautiful principle. It's a great thing. But there's two kinds of evangelism. There's friendship evangelism, and then there's just evangelism, right? But if I'm honest, I think there's a part of friendship evangelism that wars against regular evangelism, which means you don't have to know the person you're sharing the Lord with. Now, friendship evangelism says, before I can share the gospel with you, I've got to be the coach of the Little League team, have brought your kid through high school, and then on the final day, in the final game, and they've won the championship, I look at you and say, Jesus changed my life. And that you've developed a sort of friendship, and I think that's a beautiful thing, a great place for that. But there's also such a thing as just regular, flat-out, cold turkey evangelism. And guess what? They work. They both work. But listen to this. You don't have to spend years of your life waiting to build a relationship with someone to evangelize them. You don't. You just be prompt by the Holy Spirit and do it when the time is right. You'll win every time. And you'll do the role that your part to play, if that makes sense. You'll do your part to play. But friendship evangelism, again, this is sort of what has happened here. Through a kind mutual friendship, Hiram, if you read his response, he is a pagan king. He's not a Christian. He's not a God-fearing man. But his response is, blessed be the Lord this day, for he's given David a wise son over this great people. He's made it like almost a convert out of the guy. The guy's like, man, that guy's God is awesome. Look at that kid go. He's awesome. But that would be sort of what we call friendship evangelism. He used kindness and a connection, and he just witnessed to the guy. And it brings up a thing where the other reality is they say that sometimes the only Bible people will ever read is your life and mine, right? The only epistle they'll ever read is yours and mine. So what kind of Bible are they reading when they look at our lives, right? Are they reading something that's attractive, that actually is godly, that like points toward Jesus, or is it just us? And that's not necessarily great. But again, if you want to take time and evangelize through friendship, that's great. Utilize that in your life. But just remember what Paul the Apostle did. He would roll up into a city, go into a synagogue where he did not know anybody, and just start blasting the paint off the walls with the message of Jesus Christ, right? And they would be so upset with him, they would throw him out of town, they'd beat him up, they'd stone him. We read those things. Paul was beaten many times. He would go into a synagogue like, you blasphemer, they'd beat him. And then the local townspeople come out feeling bad for this poor Jewish guy that got beat up by his own kind. Like, what's wrong with you? He's like, Jesus Christ. He'd just go at it. He'd preach to anybody. And guess what? He changed the world. He's like, I got to develop friendships. And I got to get to know everybody first. And I got to plant flowers in your garden. No, that's wonderful if you can do that. But there's something to just preaching the gospel and evangelizing anyway. Sometimes it's the most fun anyway. Yeah, actually, I'm going to go ahead and say it. That is the most fun. Because the people don't know you. And then why are you assuming I want to hear this? And you're saying, I don't know. I'm not really sure why I think you want to hear this. But I'm going to tell you anyway. It's a lot of fun. But if I could say this as we end, like I did 5 minutes ago. Just with that being said, if you take this seriously and you evangelize, you share your faith with someone, please, for the love of God, be in prayer and yielded to the Holy Spirit. Don't push too hard and don't hold back. That's a very hard tension, isn't it? To know exactly where you fit in that. But sometimes you got to push and sometimes you got to blow through, and you just never know. Sometimes you got to be willing to say, I'm not going to say anything. I don't think it's the right time. And sometimes you got to be willing to say it when you're afraid.